The room was not large, but it held sound in a particular way. Wood underfoot, a faint echo off the far wall, the soft slap of bare soles when someone pivoted too hard. The low, steady rhythm of training, breath, impact, reset punctuated by the small noises people don't notice until the room becomes tense, the creak of a bench, the hiss of a heater, a cup set down too carefully. It was an ordinary night, in the way ordinary nights are built from repetition. Students arrived in staggered waves, rolling shoulders, rubbing wrists, talking quietly about work and traffic, and the small injuries they refused to respect. A few were serious enough to come early, to stretch in silence, and claim their patch of floor. Others arrived late, apologizing with their bodies more than with words. There was no announcement that something was going to happen. That is one reason witnesses remember it. The atmosphere did not change like a switch. It changed like pressure. Gradually, and then all at once. Bruce Lee was not running the room like a showman. He wasn't performing his role for attention. Those who trained around him often described the same thing. He could be warm, he could be light, but he did not decorate his presence. He didn't fill time with speeches. If someone asked a question, he answered. If no one did, he let the silence do its work. On the floor, you could see the difference in the way he moved compared to everyone else. Not faster, necessarily. Cleaner, less wasted motion. The kind of economy that makes other people feel slightly clumsy without meaning to. Students tried to copy it, often without realizing the copying was the hard part. The room's hierarchy was informal, but real. There were senior students whose confidence was earned through hours and bruises. There were newcomers still nervous enough to apologize when they walked across someone's line of sight. There was the unspoken rule that you didn't interrupt the flow unless you had to, and you didn't test the room's leadership unless you were willing to live with what followed. That rule exists in every place where men train together, even when no one says it aloud. That night, the rule was about to be touched. It began with the door. At first, it opened the way it always did someone entering, slipping shoes off, a brief glance around. But the next opening was different, heavier. A pause before the step, as if the person outside wanted to be seen entering, not simply arriving. Then there were three. They didn't come in laughing. They didn't come in shouting. They came in with the quiet confidence of people used to being treated as authority. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself because it expects the room to adjust. Their belts were dark. Their uniforms were neat. Their posture suggested familiarity with being watched. If you have trained long enough in any system, you learn to recognize the difference between someone who is serious and someone who is serious times about being recognized asterisk. Witnesses describe them as controlled, almost polite, at first. The threat was not in their words. It was in their timing arriving when training was already underway, inserting themselves into the room's rhythm without asking permission. The students felt it immediately. Not fear, attention. People stopped stretching mid-motion. Someone glanced toward the instructor's side of the room. A senior student stood a fraction straighter. When you train in a place long enough, you learn to feel intrusion the way you feel a change in air. Bruce noticed them without reacting in a way that gave them power. That is another detail that repeats in the retellings. He did not perform surprise. He did not rush to greet them. He did not posture. He simply looked briefly, and then continued doing what he was doing, as if the room's order did not need to be renegotiated. For the three men, that calm was a problem. If the room had turned toward them, they could have used it. If the instructor had hurried to accommodate them, they could have framed it as respect. But calm gives you nothing. Calm makes you work harder for attention. Calm is the opposite of a stage. They moved closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. They watched for a moment, letting their presence do what it was intended to do, make people feel evaluated. A few students shifted to create space, the way people do when they sense something might happen and want to avoid being in the way. The space that opened up in the center of the floor was not asked for. It was given by instinct. That open space made the room feel like a stage, not because anyone wanted entertainment, because the space implied a public moment. The three men spoke quietly at first. The witnesses who recall their tone describe it as controlled, almost respectful on the surface. They asked questions that carried assumptions, questions that suggested they were not there to learn, but to measure. They referenced what Bruce did, his reputation, his speed, his demonstrations, and they leaned into the most common pressure point in martial arts pride, the difference between performance and reality. In that moment, The dojo wasn't just a dojo anymore. It was a room full of witnesses. And whether anyone said it aloud or not, everyone understood the same thing. This was becoming a public test. Bruce remained still, not frozen, simply composed, as if he was willing to let them finish speaking before deciding what, if anything, needed to be done. And that composure, the refusal to rush, the refusal to inflate the moment, made the tension sharper, not softer. Because men who arrive seeking a verdict need the room to respond. If the room does not respond, they will push until it does. They didn't announce a challenge the way movies do. No dramatic stance. No shouted ultimatum. They kept their voices low, almost reasonable, which is often how public traps are built. If you speak softly, you force the other person to step closer, to lean into your frame. You make the room listen harder. You turn calm into pressure. Witnesses describe the lead man as the one who spoke most, not necessarily the strongest, but the one most invested in being seen as legitimate. He used the language that travels well across gyms and styles, words that don't require proof. Real combat. No tricks. Not choreography. The others didn't interrupt him. They stood just behind, close enough to feel like one presence. Their posture was relaxed in the way of people who want their relaxation to be read as confidence. Hands loose, shoulders set, faces carrying half smiles that weren't humor. Bruce Lee let them speak. That detail comes up again and again. He didn't cut in to correct them. He didn't defend himself in advance. He didn't try to win the room with explanation. He listened as if the words were information, not provocation. To the men who came to test him, that silence was irritating, because their framing required friction. They wanted him to argue, to react, to show emotion, anything that would make the situation feel like a contest of personalities instead of a contest of control. So they tightened the trap. They didn't do it with obvious aggression. They did it with position. They shifted in small steps until the space between them and Bruce became a narrow corridor. Not a physical blockade you could accuse them of, just enough presence that if Bruce stepped away, it would read as retreat. If he stepped through them, it would read as aggression. That's the cruelty of the public trap. It engineers your options into a display. The room understood this even if no one said it. Students who had been stretching stopped. A senior student moved slightly to the side, clearing space instinctively. Someone at the back leaned against the wall and folded his arms, not out of comfort, but out of attention. The air became thick with the feeling that something had started, even though nothing visible had happened yet. The lead man kept talking. He referenced belts. He referenced lineage. He referenced the unspoken hierarchy of martial arts, who has the right to judge whom. He implied that Bruce's work was impressive but incomplete. He suggested, without saying it directly, that Bruce hadn't earned the right to be treated as authority. In other words, he tried to place Bruce inside the old system. Bruce didn't enter the system. He stayed where he was. Witnesses describe his posture as still, but not passive, balanced. The kind of stillness that doesn't invite chaos because it doesn't offer openings. He didn't square up theatrically. He didn't raise his hands like a boxer. He simply adjusted in a subtle way, feet, hips, weight, like a man moving from conversation to readiness without announcing the shift. To trained eyes, that shift is unmistakable. To untrained eyes, it looks like nothing. That nothing is what made the room quieter. The lead man watched for a reaction. He looked for a flinch, or irritation, or a smile that could be interpreted as arrogance. When he didn't get it, he stepped closer just half a step and spoke slightly louder, not shouting, just enough to make the crowd lean in. Now the test wasn't only aimed at Bruce. It was aimed at the room. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the dojo to become a jury. Because in a private exchange, ego can survive. In a public exchange, ego becomes fragile. Bruce Lee didn't give him the satisfaction of a public argument. If he responded at all, it was brief, clean, a few words that didn't build a debate. No speeches, no explanations. Nothing the lead man could wrestle into a victory on language alone. And that's when the visitors made the move that turns pressure into record. One of them, depending on which witness you believe, extended a hand. Not a handshake, a touch, a shove, a reach for cloth or shoulder. Something small enough to be dismissed later as just testing. But in the logic of public challenges, the first contact changes everything. Once contact is made, the scene cannot be called harmless. It becomes a record, and the room felt it before it even had time to decide what it was about to see. The first contact was not dramatic. That is what makes witnesses struggle to describe it later. They expected, instinctively, that if violence happened it would announce itself raised voices, a sudden rush, a clear beginning. But this began the way real boundary crossings often begin, with something small that can still be explained away. A hand reached in, not a committed strike, not a full tackle, more like a claim, a shove that tested whether Bruce Lee would yield, a grab at the shoulder line or the front of the shirt, depending on who tells it, the kind of touch that says, "I can move you," without having to say it out loud. For a fraction of a second, the room held its breath, not because people wanted a fight, but because everyone understood what the touch meant in a training hall. It was no longer conversation. It was no longer just questions. It was the beginning of a public record. Bruce did not recoil. He did not step back. He did not swat the hand away in anger, which would have given the contact the emotional weight the challengers were looking for. Instead, witnesses described something almost disappointing to anyone hoping for spectacle. He moved as if correcting a detail, a shift of weight, a small turn of the torso, a step that changed angle more than distance. His hands came up, but not in the wide, obvious gestures of fighting for the crowd. They came up in the way you might handle a door that is being pushed toward you, meeting the force, redirecting it, removing the leverage. And then, in the tellings that stayed consistent over the years, the first challenger's posture broke. Not thrown across the room, not launched, just reorganized. The man who had reached in was suddenly concerned with his own balance. His feet did a quick, involuntary adjustment. His face changed confusion before anything else. Confusion is the mind noticing that the body has already been answered. Witnesses describe the movement as brief enough that it didn't register as a fight starting. It registered as an outcome arriving early. That early outcome is what made the crowd go quiet. Because people understand effort. They understand struggle. They understand exchanges that look fair. But when something ends cleanly, without visible struggle, it forces a different kind of attention. The first man didn't look injured in the cinematic sense. He looked corrected, and correction, in public, is harder for pride to survive than pain. The other two tightened slightly again, not dramatic, but enough that the room could feel them recalculating. They had arrived with a plan: pressure, contact, escalation. The room as witness, Bruce as the one who must react. But the reaction they got did not produce escalation. It produced hesitation. That hesitation is a pivot point in every witness-told story like this, because once a group challenge loses momentum, it becomes psychological. The next move becomes heavier. The cost of being wrong becomes visible. One of the remaining men spoke again, trying to restore narrative control. A line about real fighting, a claim that this was still friendly, something to reframe what just happened as insignificant, but the room didn't treat it as insignificant anymore. Students saw what they saw. Not technique, most couldn't name it, but the change. The sudden shift from confident intrusion to guarded uncertainty. And Bruce Lee stayed calm through it. He didn't advance to punish. He didn't chase the first man's stumble with extra strikes to make the result look dramatic. He simply returned to balanced stillness, as if the first contact had been dealt with, and the rest was choice. That stillness created a problem for the challengers. If they stepped back, they admitted the correction. If they stepped forward, they risked becoming the next correction this time, with the entire room watching more closely. Witnesses often say this is the moment when the method vanished from the story, because after that, the details blur. People remember outcomes and expressions, not mechanics. The room's memory becomes a series of snapshots, a hand reaching, a body shifting, a face changing, a confidence draining. The test had begun, and already, the story was no longer about what the challengers claimed to be. It was about what they could no longer control. What makes public tests dangerous isn't the first contact. It's what happens after the first contact fails to produce the story the challengers came for. The lead man, the one who had been speaking, the one whose language carried the most certainty, could feel the room change, not in a loud way. In the subtle, humiliating way a room changes when witnesses stop listening to your words and start watching your body. A few minutes earlier, his voice had filled the space. Now his voice sounded thinner, because the room had shifted its attention elsewhere. To Bruce Lee. To the quiet stillness that had answered the touch without drama. The lead man tried to regain control the way people often do when control slips in public. He increased the pressure while pretending he wasn't. He stepped in closer, not with an obvious attack, but with intention. He spoke again something about real combat, something about rules, something about whether Bruce would really do it. The tone was not shouting. It was insistence. The insistence of a man who needs the crowd to believe he still owns the frame. But insistence is not power. It is the request for power. Witnesses remember this moment because it is where the leader's confidence begins to look like performance. His hands moved slightly more than before. His face became more active. He looked to the room, then back to Bruce, as if checking whether the room was still with him. It wasn't. Bruce's posture stayed simple, balanced, quietly ready, not aggressive, not retreating. Ready in a way that doesn't ask permission from anyone else in the room. That readiness is what breaks people, because it forces a decision. Either you step in and risk being exposed again, or you step back and confirm that you can't. The lead man chose a third option, the option ego often chooses when it cannot accept either clear path. He tried to make the next contact look like it wasn't contact. A hand came up again toward Bruce's shoulder line, toward the chest, toward the front of the shirt, depending on the retelling. Something that could be explained as just checking distance, just demonstrating, just showing how it would be. But the room saw the intent, and the room went quieter. The lead man's hand reached in, and Bruce moved. Again, not dramatically, not like a man trying to punish, like a man removing a problem. Witnesses describe it as a small angle shift and a placement of the hands that didn't read as striking. It read as control. The kind of control that makes someone's body stop cooperating with their plan. The lead man's posture changed instantly. His shoulders dipped. His balance broke in a way that wasn't theatrical enough to be entertaining, but was clear enough to be humiliating. He took a half step to recover, and the half step revealed the truth. He was no longer deciding the distance. He was reacting to it. That is where the collapse begins. Not physical collapse, psychological. Because once a leader begins reacting, his authority drains into the floor. The other men who came with him can feel it. The room can feel it. Even the leader can feel it. And that awareness makes him worse. He tries again, because pride demands a repair. This is why witnesses often remember not one exchange, but a chain of small failures. Each time the lead man tries to push the moment back into his frame, into the story of real combat, Bruce answers with something minimal that removes the frame. No chase. No show. Just interruption. The lead man's breathing becomes visible. His jaw tightens. His eyes become too busy. He begins doing the thing men do when they are being watched and losing. He tries to look relaxed while his body betrays effort. Someone in the room shifts weight. A student swallows. A senior student's face becomes unreadable because he understands what this means in the culture of a dojo. The room has witnessed a hierarchy correction, and hierarchy corrections don't need cheering. They need silence. That silence is what the lead man can't survive. He wants noise, anger, shouting, laughter, anything that would blur what's happening and give him an excuse. But the room stays still. The stillness acts like a mirror, and in the mirror, his status looks smaller. At some point, he stops committing fully. His movements become probes instead of attacks. Half steps, half feints. Small gestures meant to test whether the outcome might change without risking another clean failure. But Bruce's posture does not change. Bruce remains balanced enough that the probes find nothing. The lead man's confidence collapses the way confidence collapses when it can't find a landing place. It turns into avoidance. He starts watching for exits, not physical exits at first, but narrative exits. A way to say, this isn't the place, or this isn't how I meant it, or this was just a demonstration, while still preserving dignity. Witnesses describe him speaking again, quieter now. The words are not remembered clearly, because words weren't the story anymore. The story was the leader's eyes. They stopped meeting Bruce's eyes directly, not because Bruce was glaring, because the leader could no longer hold the gaze of a man he had tried to reduce. That's the moment the room understands the test is over. Even if no one says it, the leader backs off slightly. The other two shift with him. Their formation, the confident shape they entered with, has dissolved into a practical cluster. Their bodies turn away from center, ready to leave. Bruce does not follow. He does not press. He does not take advantage of their retreat to score more humiliation. He simply lets them go. And that refusal to punish seals the collapse, because now the leader can't even claim he held his ground. He was released. That is sometimes the most humiliating outcome of all. After they left, the room didn't cheer. That detail appears in the versions that feel most credible. No victory laps, no clapping, not even much conversation at first. Because training halls don't always respond to moments of control the way crowds do. A crowd wants a climax. A dojo, when it's honest, absorbs the lesson in silence. The three visitors moved toward the door in a tight cluster. Their entry had been arranged, three men stepping in with confidence, belts visible, posture set, voices designed to carry. Their exit was different. They didn't collapse into panic. They didn't sprint. But their shoulders were slightly turned inward now, as if protecting something that wasn't physical. The lead man no longer spoke to the room. He spoke to his companions. Small, quick words that were meant for saving face, not for winning. A student near the edge of the mat watched them pass without expression. Another student looked down, pretending to adjust his hand wraps, even though he didn't need to. These are the small movements people make when something awkward has happened in public, and the most respectful thing you can do is not turn it into theater. Bruce Lee stayed where he was. Not in the center, not claiming the space, just present, as if the room had returned to normal before it had fully returned to normal. Someone picked up a towel. Someone returned a piece of gear to the shelf. A senior student rolled his neck and stared at the floor for a moment, replaying what he had seen without trying to translate it into flashy language. That's how the room came back to itself. Slowly, the heat of training resumed. The sounds returned, feet on wood, controlled breathing, short impacts, the small, familiar noises that help people believe the night is ordinary again. But it wasn't. Not fully, because the moment had left a mark that didn't look like a bruise. It looked like a recalibration. In the weeks that followed, people described it differently depending on where they stood in the room that night. A beginner would say it happened so fast. A more trained eye would say it was angle and timing. Someone skeptical would insist that the visitors didn't really mean it, that it was a misunderstanding, that it wasn't a real test. But even the skeptics tended to keep one thing intact. The leader's certainty did not survive the exchange. That's what made the story travel. Not the idea that Bruce beat three men. Not the fantasy of invincibility. Real gyms aren't moved by invincibility stories for long. They are moved by control stories, moments where noise loses to structure. So the incident took on a specific shape as it moved from mouth to mouth. People described how the visitors came in with a frame, real combat. No tricks, prove it. They described how the room tightened. They described the first contact. They described the way the method disappeared because it didn't look dramatic enough to be named. And then they described the thing that mattered most to the people who heard it later. Bruce didn't escalate. He didn't punish. He didn't collect an audience. He didn't turn the moment into a speech. He returned to training. That last detail is what converts an incident into a lasting legend. Because if Bruce had bragged about it, the story would have rotted quickly. Bragging invites contradiction. Bragging turns witnesses into critics. But silence invites memory. Silence keeps the story owned by the people who saw it. Over time, the story gathered small additions the way all witness stories do. Some versions said the leader was a famous name. Some said there were more than three men. Some said the test was connected to a particular rivalry between schools. Some said it happened near a film set instead of a dojo. Those details shift because human memory is not a camera. But the core survived because it was not complicated. A public trap was set. A public retreat followed. And the room learned something without needing it explained. Years later, students who weren't there would bring it up in passing. Not always as a boast, sometimes as a warning. The warning wasn't, "Don't challenge him." As if Bruce were a mythical figure. The warning was simpler and more practical. If you try to force a verdict in public, you might get one. And if the person you're testing refuses to perform for your ego, the verdict can arrive without the kind of fight you can recover from. The older students remembered the posture more than the technique. They remembered how Bruce stood balanced, quiet, unhurried. They remembered how he allowed the visitors to speak without granting them the room. They remembered that he didn't move until he had to, and then when he did, the moment changed shape. That posture became the lesson, not as philosophy delivered in speeches, as behavior, because in martial arts culture, the deepest teaching often isn't spoken, it's witnessed. The dojo itself changed a little after that. Not dramatically. The walls didn't care. The floor didn't care. But the people cared. The room held its hierarchy with more clarity. The students trained with a little more seriousness. The senior students became less interested in loud claims, not because they were afraid, because they had seen what loud claims look like when they meet quiet competence, and Bruce, in the versions that persist, continued as he always did. Teaching, refining, questioning, moving through systems without asking permission, refusing unnecessary movement, physical or social. That is why the story remained alive. It wasn't a street brawl that could be dismissed as chaos. It wasn't a tournament match that could be boxed into rules. It was a brief public moment in an ordinary training room where a small group tried to turn a man into a display, and the man refused the role. Then the night kept going. Training resumed. People went home. But the room carried the memory forward, not as a victory story, but as a quiet legend, a short incident that kept being told because it contained a kind of truth martial artists recognize instantly. Some dominance is loud, and some dominance doesn't need sound at all.